I am Dracula.
Soy Dracula.
I am Dracula, and I welcome you to my house.
I am Dracula.
Dracula is likely the most adapted literary character to ever grace the silver screen. The Transylvanian vampire has been seen in literally hundreds of films, and his popularity endures despite his ripe old age of more than 120 years. Dracula was created by Irish author Bram Stoker. Stoker, who had spent years researching Eastern European mythology, first published his book in 1897. Dracula was a success upon its release, but it was not the first popular vampire story. Previous tales include Sheridan Le Fanu's Carmilla and James Malcolm Rymer's Penny Dreadful series, Varney the Vampire. This film, The Vampire Lovers, is one of only a few adaptations of Carmilla. Bram Stoker's novel wasn't as erotic as Carmilla, which featured lesbian vampirism. But Stoker did use a similar plot element from Sheridan Le Fanu's story, namely the stalking of a British maiden by a nefarious vampire. Count Dracula did seduce and defile the innocent Lucy, but in Stoker's tale, the vampire was more of a monstrous threat, and less sexually charged than the vampire from Carmilla. The Irish author also borrowed several vampire tropes first established in the Varney the Vampire series, like puncture marks on a victim's neck, and a vampire's hypnotic powers. But what made Dracula stand out was Bram Stoker's effective writing and general accessibility. When it was originally published, Dracula was the very definition of modern contemporary writing. The book captured the zeitgeist, matching a horror story with a great adventure. And because it was well written, without flowery prose, the book is easy to read, even today. Also, Stoker cleverly disguised each chapter as a diary entry, or as a letter, or as a newspaper article. You could say the novel is almost like found footage in style, using similar tropes as the found footage film genre, only in a literary context. When Bram Stoker published Dracula in 1897, cinema was in its infancy. Most contemporary films were simply staged scenes, without much plot or story to speak of. That began to change when film pioneer and illusionist Georges Méliès expanded cinematic language with a series of trick films, little acts of magic with barely whispers of plot. Slowly, the Georges Méliès narratives expanded, and he began telling stories. At the same time, other filmmakers began developing editing techniques and cinematic language, and over a 20-year period, cinema became a medium of storytelling. It was only a matter of time before Dracula made it to the silver screen. The first known adaptation of Bram Stoker's novel was the 1921 Hungarian film Dracula Halala. No copy of this movie appears to have survived, so it is hard to say how faithful it was to the novel. From what little information there is about the film, it was most likely an extremely loose adaptation. Such was not the case with German filmmaker F.W. Murnau's NOSFERATU, which was released in 1922. The film was a direct adaptation of Stoker's story, but director Murnau had failed to secure the rights to the novel. His solution was simple. He changed the name of Count Dracula to Count Orlok. Jonathan Harker became Thomas Hutter. Mina Harker became Ellen Hutter. And Professor Van Helsing? Well, he was mostly written out of the story. Bram Stoker's widow was not amused. She took the filmmakers to court and won a decisive victory. The judge declared the film a copyright violation. He ordered all prints destroyed. Luckily, that didn't happen, and NOSFERATU is today commonly available. It is one of the most effective horror films of the silent era. The First World War devastated Germany, with death coming to every corner of the nation. Murnau used the Dracula character as a spectre of horrors that had been. NOSFERATU represented the ghost of war, and he invades the idyllic little town of Wisborg, spreading like a plague. It was innovative cinema, establishing stylistic flourishes and new cinematic language. While NOSFERATU was an unofficial adaptation of the novel, Tod Browning's Dracula from 1931 is the film that is most often credited with establishing the Dracula legacy. First off, it was a bought and paid for adaptation, albeit not an overly faithful one. Many aspects of the novel have been changed. Dracula himself is more seductive. Several major characters have been left out. And in the 1931 film, it is the character Renfield, and not Jonathan Harker, who visits Castle Dracula. But Browning's Dracula did capture the mystique of the vampire, again adapting him to contemporary society. The filmmakers coupled that mystique with a sense of eroticism, making Dracula seductive in a way only pre-Hays Code Hollywood could do. The result was a magnetic film, and Dracula became the first massively successful horror movie of the sound era. The film's strong box office performance convinced Universal studio executives that there was money to be made in the often disregarded horror genre, and they soon launched a series of unforgettable horror films, including Frankenstein, The Wolfman, The Mummy, and The Invisible Man.
Here we go gathering nuts in May, nuts in May.
Even today, over 80 years later, this first golden age of horror is influencing what we see in theaters. Hungarian actor Bela Lugosi had played Count Dracula on stage in the 1920s. But while he is today known for originating the role on the silver screen, he was not director Tod Browning's first choice. That honor belonged to Lon Chaney. Chaney was one of the most popular character actors of silent cinema, and he had made a name for himself in silent era classics such as The Phantom of the Opera and The Hunchback of Notre Dame. Chaney's ability to transform his appearance through makeup was legendary, leading to the popular saying, "Don't step on that spider, it might be Lon Chaney." Tod Browning had directed Lon Chaney in a series of macabre thrillers and dramas, and he eagerly wanted Chaney to play the Transylvanian Count. However, while on the set of the railroad drama Thunder, Chaney developed pneumonia. The illness refused to go away, and doctors discovered he had bronchial lung cancer. Chaney died in 1930. Without an obvious heir to the part, Bela Lugosi fought for the role he had perfected on stage. He convinced Universal executives to hire him, even to the point of personally reassuring the Stoker estate that the novel would be treated with respect. Lugosi's thick Hungarian accent and odd sensuality worked in his favor, and he became the first horror star of the sound era. The 1931 version of Dracula is today a slightly odd film. It has a hypnotic quality, but it also seems stylistically trapped somewhere between silent cinema storytelling and sound cinema. I believe this strangeness adds to the film's enduring quality. People loved Dracula on its initial release, and the film's continuing influence is undeniable. In the early 1950s, horror cinema found itself strangled by the suddenly dominant science fiction genre, which competed for much of the same audience. However, Dracula's popularity didn't go away. The 1931 film played on the new medium of television, and soon the character was resurrected theatrically as well. If Bela Lugosi is the actor most commonly associated with Count Dracula, then Christopher Lee surely has to be second.
Mr. Harker, I'm glad that you've arrived safely.
The British low-budget studio Hammer Films had great success with an adaptation of Mary Shelley's Frankenstein. They were eager to duplicate their success. The result was The Horror of Dracula, released in 1958. Christopher Lee played the Count as a brutal sadist. He was much more of a monster than the seductive character Bela Lugosi portrayed. There was still a sexuality about Christopher Lee's Dracula, but it was crueler, more sexually rough than mystically alluring. Horror of Dracula was a hit, and Lee played the character 6 more times for Hammer Films. The studio had a brief period of incredible success, specializing in what was at the time edgier gothic horror films. These films celebrated European horror lore, but the Hammer horror formula quickly grew stale and irrelevant. Audiences in the 1960s lived through massive social turmoil. For instance, there was the threat of nuclear war between the United States and Russia. In Asia, the Americans quickly learned what the French already knew, that you cannot win a war in Vietnam without the hearts and minds of its people. The 1960s quickly became the era of political assassinations, claiming the lives of US President John F. Kennedy, Senator Robert F. Kennedy, activists Martin Luther King and Malcolm X, and Vietnamese President Ngo Dinh Diem. Add to that a new generation was unwilling to follow in the footsteps of their parents, instead fostering the birth of modern feminism, civil liberties, and rock and roll. All this naturally affected cinema. Film audiences were rejecting the old formulas. Traditional westerns and musicals, 2 of the most popular genres up until that point, both seemed to die out overnight in the late 1960s. The studio heads were all old men who knew what had worked before would work again. And they were, of course, wrong.
So, a needle pulling thread.
Sure, right now you're reminding me about The Sound of Music, which was a massive hit. But, I might point out, nearly all the musicals that followed in its wake died at the box office.
Drop of golden sun.
At Hammer Films, the studio heads nervously tried to update the character. They wanted to make Dracula relevant to contemporary audiences. But all they did was repeat the same formula from 1958, only setting it in 1970s England instead of 19th century England. While Christopher Lee's dedication to the part was admirable, the films became more and more kitschy and comical. Dracula seemed out of date, perhaps for the first time. Meanwhile, the horror genre renewed itself with brutal efficiency. No longer limited in what they could show, filmmakers explored the violence and terror of modern life. Horror films suddenly reflected reality, drawing on contemporary fears, speaking to audiences of the day. The Exorcist became a smash hit, proving to studio brass that horror was still viable. And filmmakers like Wes Craven, Tobe Hooper, George Romero, Brian De Palma, and John Carpenter came on the scene with fierce determination, reinventing the genre.
Count Dracula. Good evening.
Studios still explored the Dracula mythology, but with limited success. The character seemed dated. In 1979, Universal Pictures returned to the story. The resulting film had a predominantly romantic approach. Actor Frank Langella was a perfect choice for Dracula, but the 1979 film didn't revitalize the legend. Don't get me wrong, it is actually a good film, with some interesting ideas and a wonderful sense of atmosphere. Frank Langella gave a brilliantly erotic and compelling performance. and female lead Kate Nelligan was more interesting and far stronger than any previous female character in the Dracula mythos. Despite this, the film seemed to live in a gothic, old-fashioned realm, not truly reflecting the era in which it was made. Perhaps that is why it didn't make much of an impact in its day. Instead, it slowly gained a following over time as people discovered it on television, DVD, and streaming. Despite the lack of interest in the 1970s, the appeal of Count Dracula was too great to fade. He was an immortal character, and even though he might have seemed out of touch with audiences throughout the late 1960s to the 1980s, Dracula was simply impossible to kill. Ironically, returning to the roots of the novel ended up resurrecting the character. Francis Ford Coppola made a new version of the story in 1992. This one titled Bram Stoker's Dracula. It was a somewhat faithful adaptation of the novel and quite an effective film. Bram Stoker's Dracula was also cinematically aware. It took the legacy of earlier Dracula films, adapting them for a modern audience. The film copied cinematic techniques seen in NOSFERATU and Dracula from 1931, using them in a modern context. Equally important, Gary Oldman's performance as Count Dracula felt at home in the 1990s, giving the audiences an anti-hero that felt like he was both a man of his era and a man of the 1990s. He was urbane, challenging, seductive, and monstrous.
All right!
I am Dracula.
What was once old was new again.
Welcome to my home.
Audiences remembered why they loved the character. Around the same time, Kenneth Branagh made a reasonably faithful adaptation of Mary Shelley's Frankenstein. And a few years later, director Stephen Sommers amused himself and audiences alike with a playful new take on The Mummy. With VHS, DVDs, and more recently digital streaming, several older films got a new life. And Dracula benefited from the incredible demand for content. His older films became easy to find, and more fans started exploring the Dracula legacy. They would not have done that had it not been for the inherent quality of the character. Dracula endures because he's a complex monster. He is human and animal alike. Villain and hero. Culprit and victim. When Dracula first appeared in 1897, his power was that he was an antichrist threatening a predominantly Christian England. And at the same time, he was an ancient evil threatening contemporary humans with old world lore and superstition. His duality, and most importantly, his adaptability, has made him a timeless character. Dracula can be whatever storytellers and audiences need him to be. In 1897, he was the ancient monster come to modern London. In 1922, he was the terror drawing people back into the shadows of a devastating war. In 1931, he was the seductive traveler, opening the eyes of audiences to horror in the sound era. In 1958, he was the brute who made horror films edgier and more violent. In 1992, he was the romantic anti-hero. In 2014, he was the superhero of ancient times, ready to come join the ranks of comic book heroes. In short, Dracula endures because he fits into whichever era in which a new adaptation is created. I particularly like what Jeffrey Reiter wrote about the vampire in the article Dracula Takes the Pulse of Culture. Reiter said, "Keep your eyes on the Count in the future, because he never seems to die, and whichever shape he assumes, it is always the perfect camouflage for the culture in which he resides. My name is Wolfcraft. I hope you have enjoyed this episode of History of Horror. If you have, please consider sharing, and subscribing. And if you're interested in checking out more of my work, I'm also a novelist. My new science fiction novel, God of Desolation, is available on Amazon. Check it out. Join me next time for episode 3, The Dawn of Horror Cinema, 1896 to 1920. Thanks a plenty.